restrooms through this door and just down the hall, and then down the hall the whole way till you hit the wall, and then turn left, and you'll find restrooms in that hallway as well. And Warren asked me to tell you that at 11:30 sharp, the first session will end so that we can get ready for lunch, okay? But again, it's good to have you here. We're pleased that we could be the host for this particular gathering of the Pennsylvania Council of Churches. Hi, Gary. Boy, I haven't seen you for a long time. Of course, well, I've been retired since 2001, so you get out of the loop, you know. But where's Warren? Here's Warren Eschbach, who's going to tell us all about the day. Again, welcome.
Thank you, Guy. Good morning, everyone. I'm Warren Eschbach, and I have headed the planning committee to put this event together. I don't know, it seems like about 18 months ago, maybe even longer, that Gary Harkey asked me if I would get a committee together to promote this event. I wasn't sure why he chose me until this morning. Then he told me one of my colleagues in the Church of the Brethren, who happened to be on the board, suggested, his name is David Steele, of course he's not here today, but he suggested that I do this, and I'm glad that he did. And I'm glad that Gary asked me, because it's been a fun event to plan. I hope we'll have a day of learning. I also want to take this time, because we may not have time to do it later, but I want to thank the members of the planning committee. And I think right now I'd like to ask them to stand, the members of the planning committee, just stand, and let's give them a warm welcome and thank them for their work. Witness in common. We all hope that that's what we're about these days, but this takes on significant meaning when we discuss the exploration of our full communion agreements and what they mean. They've been around for quite a while, but sad to say, not everybody in the pew, either pulpit or pew, recognize that they exist sometimes. And we thought it would be fun to bring together a group of people who take seriously these full communion agreements, and people who are working with them in judicatories and congregations, and sit down and have a discussion about them today. What they mean, what their possibilities are for the future, and what the hope that they can bring to the witness of Christ's church in today's world. So that's what we're kind of about today. For our plenary speaker this morning, we have the Very Reverend Dr. Tom Ferguson, who is Academic Dean at Bexley Seabury Seminary Federation, where he teaches church history. He came there in 2011 after 10 years of service on the staff of the Episcopal Church Center, first as Associate Deputy to the Presiding Bishop for Ecumenical and Religious Relations, and then he was appointed Ecumenical and Religious Officer in 2010. He served as a primary theological consultant and staff support for bilateral theological dialogues with the Presbyterian Church, USA, the United Methodist Church, the Moravian Church, and the Roman Catholic Church, along with supporting full communion relationships with the ELCA, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, Old Catholic Churches, and the Philippine Independent Church. He completed his PhD work at the Church Divinity School of the Pacific, and he has done work in early Christianity in the debates over Trinitarian theology. He has an MDiv from Yale and a certificate in Anglican studies from Berkeley at Yale. Now, all of those, they're heavy degrees. But his students today, at where he is academic dean, they have given him another title. Crusty old dean. Now, I'm not sure whether he deserves that or not, but with students it doesn't matter. You get it anyway. And so we're glad to have the crusty old, not so old dean here with us today to share with us and inspire us. We're going to have him do the plenary session. Oh, I also forgot to mention, he's a Red Sox, and a Bruins fan. Now, for those of us who follow the Orioles or the Phillies or whatever other teams there may be, it's all right. We're glad to have you among We're going to have our plenary session first with Tom speaking. Then will be time for plenty of questions and answers, and we will break right promptly at 11:30 for pre-lunch break and then lunch. We have a full day. Thank you for coming. Good you're here. Tom?
Good to be here. Begin with a word of prayer. A collect for the mission of the church from the Book of Common Prayer. The Lord be with you.
And also with you.
Let us pray. O God, you have made of one blood all the peoples of the earth, and you sent your blessed Son to preach peace to those who are far off and to those who are near. Grant that people everywhere may seek after you and find you. Bring the nations into your fold, pour out your Spirit upon all flesh, and hasten the coming of your kingdom. Through Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. Amen. Well, good morning. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. It's a pleasure to help out my colleague, Gary Harkey. I know he'd been dreaming about an event like this for years. It seems like he and I have been talking about an event like this for years. So it's good to finally be here and to have a chance to talk about some of our full communion partnerships and also the way in which these full communion partnerships are functioning in this particular state of the church. I'm going to pull this up and see if everything works. Can you all see that? There's one there, there's one there. You can look here, you can look there. Witness in Common is our title, Exploration of Full Communion Agreements. I want to talk a little bit about my own background and context, and then talk about the three things I want to focus on and the time we have for this morning. As I was driving out here, and I don't need to tell you all this, but Pennsylvania is a very long state. So I was driving out here from Columbus. I put this up on the slide as I was putting this talk together. And I'm thinking about the two similar but different contexts I've engaged ecumenical work in the last few years. I spent 10 years on denominational staff, and that was very much sort of institutional ecumenism, like United Nations ecumenism, a staff liaison to these ecumenical dialogues. You'd get this team, and you get this other team, and it's like you're negotiating some sort of treaty. I was at when you're an ecumenical officer, it's always fun when you're at cocktail parties and dinner parties. It helps that I have a lot of friends who aren't churchgoers, so they aren't in this whole world. And I was at this cocktail party, someone asked me what I did, and I was explaining to it. And this guy was in a business background. He goes, "How many deals have you closed in the last few years?" I'm like, that's what I was talking about the United Methodist dialogue. I'm like, I've been working on it for 10 years. I don't even know when I'm going to close that deal. Made me think of the different model that we're talking about. And so I had 10 years in that institutional, theological, ecumenical dialogue. And now for the past, going on 3 years, in a slightly different context, preparing people for ministry in a thoroughly ecumenical context. This Episcopal seminary that's kind of nestled like those Russian Matryoshka dolls, kind of nestled within an ELCA seminary. And looking at, so I had perspective from some of the institutional, denominational ecumenism, but also really living side by side with some ecumenical partners and engaging in some common mission and ministry together. Yesterday afternoon, we had our Kristallnacht service with the Jewish community in Columbus, Ohio, where Lutherans, Episcopalians, and the Jewish community gathered together to celebrate and commemorate that remembrance. So that kind of side-by-side ecumenism. So reflecting on that, there's three things I'd like to do in this portion of our time together today. There's the roadmap for today. And I'm so proud. I figured out how to animate text in PowerPoint. So I just had to try it out. Here's the roadmap then. First, I want to reflect on the historical contexts that produced a number of our full communion agreements. They're birthed and produced in a particular time, in a particular place, in a particular context of North American Christianity. Then, note that that context has changed dramatically, substantially, and thoroughly. And then, try and put those two together. What does it mean to have these full communion agreements produced in one context? Now that we have a radically changed context, how can they be in service? of that new reality. So that's the roadmap for this morning. Ecumenical harvest is plentiful. I found myself, as I was listing all these, do we have too many ecumenical full communion agreements? We have the ELCA, United Church of Christ, Presbyterian Church USA, Reformed Church in America, and the Formula of Agreement. We have the Episcopal Church, Evangelical Lutheran Church in America agreement called to Common Mission in 2001. Moravian Church, Northern and Southern Provinces in the ELCA, following our shepherd. Moravian Church, Northern and Southern Provinces, with the Episcopal Church, finding our delight in the Lord. You have to point out, you've got to give the Moravians credit. Those full communion agreements have the best names. All right? I mean, even called the Common Mission was originally the Concordat of Agreement. See, I was talking about these institutional ecumenical treaties, the Concordat of Agreement. So we pepped that up a little bit with Call to Common Mission. But still, you got to give the Moravians credit for having better titles for their full communion proposals. Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, United Methodist Church, and breaking ecumenical news. Talking with Brother Harkey earlier this morning, there's a document for United Methodist, Moravian Church Full Communion, which is about to go live. Yes, about to go live. So hopefully, again, back to institutional ecumenism, we'll have to sync that up with the rotation of their denominational church bodies. And this is where Episcopal, thank goodness we did Episcopal ELCA Full Communion when we did, because we used to be on a 2-year, so ELCA used to be on a 2-year and Episcopal Church used to be on a 3-year, so every 6 years, the two conventions would sync up. Now that the Lutherans have moved to every 3 years, they will never meet again in the same summer. So, and this isn't even an exhaustive list of full communion partnerships. We could spend a good part of our time this morning laying some of those out. United Church of Christ, Disciples of Christ. We could talk about a lot of other full communion arrangements. So I found myself thinking, oh, Felix culpa, oh, happy fault. Some problems are good problems to have. Some problems are good problems to have. It means we have a lot to harvest. It means we have a lot of fruit to harvest. So changing contexts. I had to work a quote from Lenin into a discussion of full communion agreements. I was a Russian studies major in a previous life. Lenin's famous quote was, "Imperialism is the final stage of capitalism." He was wrong. He was wrong, not correct. And that was not the end of capitalism. But this quote came to mind as I thought about full communion agreements, because it captures the dynamic of how one set of changes can shape another completely different set of changes. So apart from Lenin, I chose the less genocidal example as well. Anyone recognize that symbol? Anyone? Yes, it's Napster. It's Napster. Any other Gen Xers out there spend most of the summer of 2000 downloading music off of Napster? Anyone? And that's why I spent most of the summer of 2000 with my 33.6 dial-up modem. Why did I pick Napster and Lenin to talk about full communion? Because this revolution in how we understand and share music is another example of the way in which a whole slew of changes have come together in the past 10 or 20 years in society to profoundly reshape how we relate to one another as individuals, and how we relate to institutions, and how we communicate and share information with one another. As much of one of the great axioms of church history is when the world changes, the church changes as well. And we're clearly in the midst of another kind of suite of changes, like in the Reformation period, like in the 4th century, like in the 19th century. We're talking about a tremendous confluence of change in the broader culture that is impacting our churches. Life was good in the 1990s in the music industry. CD sales were at an all-time high. And then someone developed this program to let people share music to one another. Don't buy any CDs. Just do it over the computer. Of course, the Recording Industry Association of America fought it tooth and nail, sued, shut it down. You would think, hey, I'm in the business of selling music. Somebody invented something that 1 million people have downloaded to share music. Maybe that's another way. No. It chose to specifically fight that change, shut Napster down, but the reality was Napster was more in tune with the future of music. Anything would be available at any time, in any way, at a different kind of pricing system. And guess where we buy our music from now, if we do. If we even buy music. We don't buy it from the Recording Industry Association of America. Buy it from Apple. Buy it from iTunes, who has an iTunes account. Download it from iTunes. Stream it. The context in the music industry changed. There's resistance to that change, but it didn't matter. The new paradigm is going to bubble up. The question is, how do you accommodate and adapt to that? So you better start swimming, or you'll sink like a stone. Okay, get back to full communion agreements. This is about full communion, right? Okay, let's get back to full communion agreements. So to paraphrase Lenin, were full communion agreements the last phase of denominationalism? In the 1990s, you could say many people thought our denominations were, if not booming, were certainly different than the way we probably understand them now. Booming probably isn't a term we might use, but here's just a couple things from my own tradition, the Episcopal Church. Seminary enrollments were up in the 1990s. Seminary enrollment was good. Ordinations in the Episcopal Church were 270 priests ordained. In 1995, peaked at 400 priests ordained in the year 2002. The ELCA and the Episcopal Church even showed modest growth in some areas. The 1990s for the Episcopal Church was the decade of evangelism. We can sometimes wonder if that succeeded in the way we had intended in the Episcopal Church. But it's clear if you look at attendance numbers and membership numbers in the 2000s, where we're talking about significant changes in our attendance and our demographics. The 1990s, in retrospect, looked like they were booming. I'll only speak for my own tradition. At this stage, we had another membership report from the Episcopal Church came out in the last few days. The Episcopal Church has lost 25% of the people attending on Sunday mornings in the last 12 years. 25% of Sunday. I mean, granted, with the proviso that numbers aren't everything, and average Sunday attendance isn't necessarily the best metric in the world. With all those provisos, that's still a fairly sobering number. It's gone from about roughly 800 to 825,000 on a Sunday morning in all the Episcopal churches in the country to 600, 620,000 or so. That's about a quarter of average Sunday attendance. So the 1990s don't seem so bad. Church was booming. At least if it wasn't the way it was now. Ecumenism was certainly booming in the 1990s. A series, all the dialogues that I listed in that initial slide, Episcopal Church, Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, formula agreement between Reformed traditions, churches in the Reformed traditions, and the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. You talk about closing the deals. Those dialogues had been going, for instance, the Lutheran Episcopal Church dialogue began in the late 1960s. There were 3 different rounds of dialogue in the 60s, the 70s, and the 80s. That agreement that came into effect in 2001 was the product of 32 years of work. 32 years of work. So ecumenism, all those dialogues were coming to fruition in the 1990s. And we had an incredible spate, an incredible flurry of full communion proposals. So while that was going on, while ecumenism in many ways was coming to a peak in the 1990s, or at least a particular understanding of ecumenism was coming to a peak in the 1990s, all sorts of other things were happening as well. Funny thing happened while we were coming up with all those full communion proposals. Profound, seismic shifts in religion in North America. This is not an exhaustive list. We could spend the whole morning just talking about this slide. A generational shift, a fundamental difference in how millennial generation views religion in churches, but not just religion in churches. This is something that I think as a Generation Xer, as someone who's 45, as much as, again, I don't think generational differences are all they're cracked up to be in some ways, but in some ways they can be indicators and they can be bellwethers of larger changes in the culture. As a Gen Xer, I like to think I have one foot in each world. I can kind of speak boomer and I can kind of speak millennial as well. I can translate between the two. One of the things I keep telling a lot of my fellow Gen X and boomer colleagues is this is not just about the kids and their new technology. This is talking about a really fundamental reshaping of how people communicate communicate and relate to institutions. This is apart from just the church. This is apart from just the church. All institutions, not just ecclesial institutions, but other civic, political, cultural institutions as well. So we're talking about a really fundamental reordering and reshaping. This is different. This is in many ways profoundly different, I think, than some of the differences between, say, the boomer generation and the Gen X generation. We're talking about a really profound generational difference and a reordering of how folks look at society and look at one another. So that's one thing. That's one thing. We have ongoing demographic changes, increasingly diverse country. And we're looking at majority non-white United States by 2040, 2045, depending on how the demographic trends work out. And guess what? With Protestant denominations that by and large are overwhelmingly Anglo, and perhaps just as significantly, if we want to pull it back from Protestant denominations that are predominantly Anglo, we're talking about religion in America, which tends to be homogenous in its way. As one great scholar put it, the most segregated place in America is Sunday morning. Regardless of, we're talking about majority Asian Presbyterian churches, majority African American, historically African American churches, majority Anglo-Protestant churches. We're talking about an American Christianity that is out of step in its homogeneity from a society that's becoming increasingly multicultural. So we have some pretty profound demographic shifts that have been going on for decades, but we sort of no longer have the ability to overlook that. The digital revolution, profound reordering of how information is shared and how people relate. It kind of builds on the generational piece. I tell this story that I heard. Anybody out there listen to Wait, Wait, Don't Tell Me at NPR? Yeah, you remember when they were talking about the Facebook story about the two kids who fell into the drain? These two kids were walking, and they fell into a storm drain. And the first thing they did was they updated their Facebook status. Exactly, everyone laughs, right? It was crazy. But the thing is, they then asked those kids, well, what? Said, well, we wanted our friends to know we were okay. We were going to meet some people. We figured we'd be down there for a while. We didn't want them to worry. So we updated our status that way we could let people know where we were, and that we were okay, and then we used our phone to call help. This is not just about the wacky kids that can't stay off the Facebook. It's about the way in which they relate to their friends, how they communicate. So this is sort of just a very tiny example. Whereas most folks would, I don't know, shout for help. I think this is an indicator of just a really profound reshaping of how we communicate and understand a relationship to one another. So a profound digital divide. We had some internal issues in the 1990s and the 2000s. I'm in the Episcopal Church, so I'd say probably my denomination is the only one who had these problems in the 1990s and the 2000s. Riven by these internal theological debates precisely at the time of all these other changes were happening. As I tell some of my students in my church history class, will this be like when we studied the 1800s and the Episcopalians were arguing about whether we should put candles on the altar, while most other American denominations were arguing about slavery? The Episcopal Church never split over slavery, split over secession, not slavery, because it never took a stand that allowed it to have a split. When the General Convention of the Episcopal Church was meeting in Philadelphia in 1862, one of the local rectors, a guy named Phillips Brooks, said, you would be hard-pressed to think that they knew that there was a war going on, or if there was a war going on, if they should say anything about it. I wonder in 100 years when we look back on this time and think, what were the churches arguing about when they should have been paying attention to all these other things? I don't know. But I sometimes think that. So a funny thing happened in the 1990s and the 2000s. Of course, these changes were simmering for decades. None of this stuff happened overnight. But clearly came to a head in the 1990s and the early 2000s. Okay, let's bring these two things together. Most of our major full communion agreements were birthed in the 1990s, came to fruition in the 1990s. So that means they were birthed in the context of denominationalism, exactly when the ground had shifted under denominationalism. That's why Lenin's phrase came to my mind, imperialism, the last stage of capitalism, or full communions agreements, kind of the last stage of denominationalism. That's what's been sticking in my head. Shaped by the language of institutional ecumenism at the time when how we understand institutions is shifting. Okay, who's read some of these full communion agreements? Who's read some? This is a safe place. It's a safe place if you have it. That's fine. You don't have to. But who's read some of these things? What are they about? Name like a couple things. If you think, I say, we'll do word association. I say full communion agreement, and you say whatever comes in your head. Full communion agreement.
Orderly exchange.
Orderly exchange.
Mission.
Mission.
Sacraments.
Pardon?
Sacraments.
Sacraments. Right, right. Other things that come up.
Finding a new job and keeping your pension.
The brother back there is not too far off. It's not too far off. Well, that's when you knew it's getting serious in the Episcopal Church, is when you bring in the church pension group. Well, so that's when we knew that when we knew it was time to bring in the people from the pension group. We knew we were getting really close to come, because that's when you had to bring in those people as well. Exactly. What are these things about? They're about ecclesiology, sacramental theology. They are about, if we're Episcopalians, then we get to talk about our historic episcopate, or we have to talk about our confessional documents in some way. How are these reflected and represented in these things? These are extraordinarily ecclesial documents. Naturally, of course, they're full community agreements, but largely focus around the classic faith and order topics that the ecumenical movement have been talking about in the 20th century. Right? Mission, baptism, Eucharist, and ministry. To give a quick shorthand. That sounds like a great name for a paper, by the way, baptism, Eucharist, and ministry. But these documents were largely about the faith and order and ecclesiological issues of the ecumenical movement in the 20th century. Of course, what else could they have been about? But, Richard Niebuhr wrote in 1922 that American denominationalism is a conformity to the caste system of society. That Niebuhr was writing in the 1920s that the real dividing elements in American Christianity are race and class. We could talk about gender, we could talk about human sexuality, we can talk about a number of issues that emerged after Niebuhr wrote the social sources of American denominationalism. I hope he didn't go on a book tour for that book. That would have been hard to say. The social sources of American denominationalism. Do any of these full communion agreements talk about any of those things? No. Not a one. Not a one. Here comes, old man story. Back when I was ecumenical officer, back in my day, this was a dream I had for the United Methodist Church Episcopal Church Dialogue. There are no theological church dividing issues between United Methodists and Episcopalians. We can make some. I mean, if you give church people enough time, they can find some, clearly. We could clearly find some if we wanted to. And Anglicans and Methodists have said this on an international level. 2 rounds of dialogue at the international level have said there are no substantive church dividing issues between Methodists and Anglicans. In the United States, the real issues have been race and class and social class. Those have been the real church dividing issues. Not only that, Anglicans who became Episcopalians and Methodists exported this to the African American community. Absalom Jones and Richard Allen are both members of St. George's Methodist Church in Philadelphia. One ended up becoming the first African American priest in the Episcopal Church. One ended up founding the first historically African American Methodist denomination. So these are divisions which in turn were replicated within the African American community itself. One of the things that we tried in the United Methodist Episcopal Church Dialogue is ecumenism has to begin to address issues that are beyond the classic faith and order questions, if it's going to have any kind of relevancy going forward. And in some ways, this is because of the overwhelming success of the ecumenical movement. I don't mean to necessarily look down too much on the ecumenical movement of the 20th century. It's in part because of tremendous confluence that has been found on a lot of these historic questions of sacramental theology. As an old mentor of mine put it when I called him up and told him I was appointed the Associate Ecumenical Officer for the Episcopal Church, his old mentor of mine. Says, you know, when I was getting started in ministry in the 1950s, interfaith dialogue was Baptists and Episcopalians. And he said, we wouldn't say that anymore. We wouldn't say that anymore. And he was one, he's one that sort of gave me that kind of perspective. And in many ways, there's a tremendous, we're sort of breathing the air and swimming in the pond of the successes of the ecumenical movement of the 20th century. By and large, we don't rebaptize persons from Episcopalians. Practice some rebaptism back in the 20s and the 30s. We don't do that anymore. We don't even think of it if you've been baptized with water in the name of the Trinity. For instance, whom we permit and invite to communion. Communion isn't as denominationally closed as it once had been, by and large. So in some ways, we're swimming in the successes of the 20th century ecumenical movement, which I think means we have to fully embrace the challenges of what do we need to be talking about in the next century of the ecumenical movement, in that 21st century. Okay, that was a whole thing around how these full communion agreements are birthed in these contexts of denominationalism, shaped by the language of institutional ecumenism at a time when that understanding of institutions is shifting. I found myself thinking, I was driving out here saying, could we even do this now? Could we even pull off this whole flurry of ecumenical agreements? The amount of time and energy and money and staff and resources, could we even do it? You know, when one of the most haunting texts I ever read from the ancient church were these two monks who were walking from the St. John Lateran in Rome out to their monastery, and they're walking by and they see the aqueducts coming into Rome. This is in the 6th century. They know what they are. They know that they're aqueducts that bring water in. You know, these are monks that copied ancient texts. They knew that rich Romans had hot and cold running water in the 1st century AD. And they have no idea how they work. They have no idea how to fix them. There's no running water in Rome. This notion that they knew what these things were, and they knew that they could never pull off what people had pulled off a couple hundred years earlier. The context had changed so dramatically. These two monks kind of walking by looking at these aqueducts. What are these things? We know what they are. How did they ever make those things work? I sometimes think of that when I look at these full communion agreements. How did we ever do these things? How do we ever do this? I don't think we could do it now. I'll give some real specifics here in terms of, do we even have the resources? In 2014, the Ecumenical Office of the Episcopal Church, and I'll only speak for my own church again, I would never presume to speak for another Christian communion, but we've had some bumps in our national church staff a little bit. It's been a rough decade. It's been a rough decade in terms of how we understand our denominational staff. But here's just some cold, hard numbers, friends. 2014, we have 1/3 of the human being staff and nearly half the financial resources it had in 2000, not adjusted for inflation. 1/3 of the people and just half the funding to carry things off. We couldn't do it. Couldn't pull it off now. Couldn't pull it off. Even if we could, here's the other question that haunts me as I think about this. Would our churches even care? Would they even care? As I put it here, are these agreements too institutional in an increasingly post-denominational and networking age? One of the most sobering couple of years, and by the way, most uplifting couple of years I ever spent was, I spent some time as a campus chaplain in Madison, Wisconsin, and just got this really amazing insight into what a possibility of the future church might be. I was dealing with college students all the time, which is invigorating, but I had this profound epiphany moment when I realized that young people hadn't changed. Young folks were still interested in finding community, finding some kind of meaning in life, how to live an ethical life, how can I live out in my life the principles that I hold dear, things like fairness and justice. It's just the church wasn't even on their radar screen, that this could be a place where they could live out these kinds of things. I remember showing up at a panel at the University of Wisconsin-Madison that was on climate change. And someone coming up to me afterwards and saying, what are you doing? I mean, in a polite way, what are you doing here? I had no idea Christians cared about climate change. I said, oh, sure, stewardship of creation, and I talked about the Ecumenical Patriarch in Constantinople was talking about this back in the 1980s and the 1990s, that there's a profound Christian understanding of stewardship of this world, that creation is good, and God has entrusted us to be stewards of it. Completely blew this person's mind. So I just thought, religious people were these crazy, fundamentalist climate change deniers. This notion that churches could have something to say about this. How the church has kind of failed to articulate how we relate to what we have to offer to a world that's still asking for all the same things. Connection, community, meaning, and living a decent and ethical life. Don't you think the church has something to offer? Don't you think the church has something to offer? The gospel has something to offer in a world where people are still asking those questions. All right. We sometimes talk about unintended consequences. How many meetings have you sat in where people say, well, let's think about what some of the unintended consequences of this might be? I'm like, well, by definition, unless they're really obvious, they don't know what they are. You just kind of make the decision and live with them. Unintended consequences. We talk about that a lot. I found myself thinking about unintended blessings, which I don't think we talk about as much. What are the things that could be really amazing and cool that would happen if we did this? Instead of just instead of just dreaming up, worst case scenarios, what are some unexpected blessings? Some unintended blessings that might emerge from this? I give the example of Alexander Nobel, right? He thought dynamite was a miracle invention. It would speed up, it would make mining a lot easier, it would make engineering a lot safer. Of course, it didn't take too long for people to figure out some other off-label uses for dynamite than Mr. Nobel had intended. It didn't take much, human nature didn't take much long at all. But of course, he used that money to endow the Nobel Prize, which celebrate the greatest achievements of humanity. So ecumenical, I don't think we can deny this. Ecumenical agreements were being brought to fruition right at the time that the ground underneath them were shifting. Oh, that's a really bad typo there, isn't there? Two of the things that came up to me here, are they like, coming up with like the best, newest horseshoe, right as the first Model T rolls off the assembly line? Is it like winning the award for Best Vaudeville Act of 1955? Justice TV is coming into being. In 100 years, is that what we'll think? Oh, look at these full communion agreements. Aren't they kind of a quaint relic of a time of denominationalism? Or could these full communion agreements have unintended blessings as well? Bringing these two pieces together, I wanted to talk a little bit about the context of some of these full communion proposals, and then some of the changing context. And I'll move a little bit into the third piece of the presentation here. Is there a way in which these full communion agreements, rather than being the relics of this particular phase in Christianity, could they, in fact, be the resources for that future church, for that present church that we have? Can they actually be in the service of bringing it into being? It's biblical, right? This whole question of unintended blessings. Paul said, I planted, but Apollos watered. Moses said, would that all God's people were prophets? How much does source and intention matter so long as it is in the service of the gospel? Our full communion agreements are legacies of our denominationalism. But guess what? They have lots of company. So are our denominational seminaries. So are the buildings. I live in Columbus, Ohio, and I did this drive just yesterday. A lot of the old churches are downtown. So I was in downtown Columbus going to church. I was going to Old Trinity Lutheran Church in downtown Columbus. Great church. So I was driving home, and I drive down Broad Street. There's the Lutheran Church. There's the United Methodist Church. There's two UCC churches, because one was congregational and one was one of them German Reformed types. Lots of Germans in Columbus. And my wife says to me, why are there two UCC churches? I said, well, one must have been a German Reformed or some kind of Germanic church. My grandmother, was the denominational archivist for the United Church of Christ at 14 Beacon Street, Boston. So I grew up hanging out in the Congregational Library. And she never was quite too sure about those Germans. Not so much, I think, not so much that she thought they were too Presbyterian in terms of their polity. But I mean, as a good Boston Brahmin, I think she was concerned about them being German more than anything else. She wasn't too sure about it. She came around on that question. So we're driving down Broad Street, Columbus. Within a span of 3 miles, Episcopal Church, Lutheran Church, United Methodist Church, 2 UCC churches, Presbyterian Church. Within just a 3-mile span. These big brownstone legacy churches, one after the other. All struggling, except for the Presbyterian Church, all struggling in their own way to make sense of what it means. This is part of, as a seminary dean, I interact with these various folks. When I talk to the pastors of these churches, what are they talking about? How do we do urban ministry in this context? How can we find some other uses for our building than just on Sunday morning? They're all asking the exact same questions. But we have five of them asking them separately in some ways. So we have other legacies of our denominationalism. We have other legacies. Our buildings, these full communion agreements, our missional infrastructure. That's everything from our polity to our middle judicatory structures. One of the things I always found most entertaining about especially when you're getting to that point, when you know you're within striking distance of concluding an ecumenical agreement. Like I said, you got to bring in the pension people at one point. That's when you know it's getting real, when you bring in the pension people. The other time you know it's real is when you bring in the disciplinary people. Because, of course, under whose system of discipline will this ecumenical agreement work? One of the things that I love, I'm amazed the Lutherans hung with us for so long. Because we're getting to that point with the Lutherans where we're, because the magic wand we waved in the Lutheran full communion agreement was, January 1st, 2001, every Lutheran pastor in good standing and every Episcopal priest in good standing, as of that date, January 1, 2001, was eligible for service in either church. After that date, the provisions of the agreement go into effect. So, it's great. I mean, essentially it was a huge grandparenting in of all those clergy who were in good standing as of January 1, 2001. You may see where this is going. We have to figure out who all those clergy are, right? If you're going to do this, because then, 5 years from now, and this is happening, so-and-so wants to be received into the Episcopal Church, you have to find out their sort of ordination history. So we have to come up with a list of all these people. Lutherans, gotta love the Lutherans, come in, walk down, big stack of paper, here's all our pastors, good standing, as of when we printed this out, 2 minutes ago. I said, where's your list? That's a really good question. Like, we could ask the church pension group, but, there's probably some clergy, they may be working in non-Episcopal institutions of some kind, may not be registered, or may not have their information updated. So that's a good question. Could go to them. He said, well, what we think you have to do is ask every single all 109 dioceses for the list of clergy that are canonically resident. Okay, have you done that? No, we just thought up the answer. No, we haven't done that yet. So anyway, I'm amazed the Lutherans hung with us for so long. So, our missional infrastructures, everything from our biblical judicatories to our seminary systems. I mean, good heavens, I hear, I'm in, as a dean of an Episcopal seminary, nestled within a Lutheran seminary. It's made all that much clearer to me as well, because I have to do everything twice, because I have my own seminary, and I sit in on all these meetings at the Lutheran seminary. It's all it's the same conversation, right? Do we have too many seminaries in the Episcopal Church? Do we have too many seminaries in the Lutheran Church? How do we relate to these people that are going to other non-Lutheran or non-Episcopal seminaries? So we're having the same conversations about what to do with these legacies of our denominational stuff and our denominational structure. Okay. Image of the Steward of Gondor keeps coming back to mind. Anyone see the Lord of the Rings movies? I mean, again, with better personal hygiene than the Steward of Gondor, I would say. Image that keeps coming back to me. It keeps coming back, especially where we are in North American Christianity right now. One thing to keep in mind, my friends, is these kind of changes. It's like F. Scott Fitzgerald's line about how someone goes bankrupt, gradually and then suddenly. All right, how do you go bankrupt? Gradually and then suddenly. These changes, we've been talking about gradually. Soon it's going to be suddenly. Mark Knoll, the great historian of North American Christianity, wrote about this when he wrote about the province of Quebec in Canada. He said the 1950s and the 1960s, it was one of the most culturally and religiously observant places in North America. You know, astounding rates of mass attendance in French Catholic Quebec. The Catholic Church handled education, handled most of healthcare, handled a lot of social services. He said within a generation, it had all been swept away. Within 50 years, you know, church attendance rate in French Quebec now resembles Paris more than it resembles Toronto. This is what Noel was talking about. These kind of changes can happen gradually and then suddenly. And I think that's exactly where we are in the United States right now. I had a friend, I've changed the speech I give to friends who are, for some strange reason, considering being nominated for bishop. I mean, I'm of the age where my friends are starting to get nominated for bishop. It's one of those things I don't tell you about, the phases of life. You have when you get married and have kids, they didn't say there'd be the phase when all your friends are getting asked to be, asking you for advice about whether to put their name in for bishop. Notice, I'm not crazy enough ever to do that, but so it's friends coming to me for advice. Here's one of the things I tell every single one of them. So you have to decide whether you want to make some hard choices and close 20% of your churches, or not make those choices and close 50% of your churches. If you're not willing to do that, don't go forward in this conversation. You know what's scary? 10 years ago, I was saying 10% and 30%. I've already upped it to 20 and 50. In 10 years, will it be 50 or 70? I don't know. Granted, these demographics and these dynamics vary from place to place. No two dioceses are the same. But we're clearly looking at a profound reshaping. This is where we're talking about gradually. It may feel suddenly, but it wasn't really suddenly. It's been coming on for decades. So this is why this image of the Steward of Gondor keeps coming back to me. And if you haven't seen the Lord of the Rings movies, the stewards of Gondor are not the kings of Gondor. They're very clearly not the kings. They're waiting for the king to come. And the steward's job is to preserve as much as the steward can to hand that over when the king does come. It's transitional time, transitional figure, and very much a stewarding. How can the steward of Gondor preserve the integrity and the resources of the community until the king comes to take over? I think about this. How are we stewarding what we have from a very different understanding of church? I mean, I think we're coming to the, and other sociologists and scholars of North American religion and global Christianity are far more erudite about this than I am. But it seems fairly clear to me we're in the end of a nice 500 window of Christianity. Things that were birthed in the Reformation period, birthed in a time of profound globalization as well. The 16th century and the 17th centuries as times of globalization. We're coming to the end. We're probably already at it, actually, of that cycle. The churches look profoundly different at different times across the world. We need to remember that. The church looked profoundly different in Dura Europos in the 3rd century in what is now Iraq. It looked profoundly different when it was a small house church on the edge of the world. The church looked profoundly different in the 6th century, the 10th century, and the 14th century. It's going to look profoundly different in the 21st century. It's going. There's nothing we can do about that, because that's how the gospel is supposed to adapt from age to age and time. And this is something we should be celebrating, that the message we have in Christianity can burst beyond the boundaries of whatever we can try and contain it in. something we should be celebrating. Though, as the great Ed Freeman once pointed out, people don't fear change, they fear loss. It's going to mean letting go of a lot of things. And I think we will see, this is something that it's been interesting to see in the past decade or so. I think, unlike in the 1990s, I had to convince a lot of people in the 1990s that we were in the midst of some really serious and profound changes. And people just didn't believe me. Not just me, other folks as well. Other folks as well writing this stuff. I don't think you need to convince people of that anymore. That's safe to say. But then where folks are, and where communities are, on that kind of slider. And so, all right, now they may realize things are profoundly changed. Kind of what now? What now? I think we can see this across the various layers and structures of our church. Okay, think about this stewardship metaphor and the future of the church. How can we steward what we have to shape that future church? I talk about this with the denominational staff. This is just an example, I think, of a conversation we're going to be having over and over again on all different levels of the church, from local community ministeriums to national church. What kind of denominational staff should we have? We probably got to have one. But the one we have now is such a legacy of a particular time and place in the church. Our denominational staff looks like, guess what? The time when it was created, the 1950s and the 1960s. When the Episcopal Church, when the cornerstone of the National Council of Churches on Riverside Drive and the Episcopal Church headquarters were laid at the same time. They were being built at exactly the same time. You may ask, why did the Episcopal Church? Because the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church said, my people work for me and not for the National Council of Churches. Doubly awkward. He was also president of the National Council of Churches at the time and laid the cornerstone of 475. This is the kind of stuff you can't make up. You can't make up. He was president of the National Council of Churches and presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, laid both cornerstones with Dwight David Eisenhower helping to lay the cornerstone of the National Council of Churches. This is something in a generation, the profound change of Christianity in North American culture. In John F. Kennedy's famous speech, where he says, I won't take orders from the Pope. He says, and neither will I take them from the National Council of Churches. No one ever remembers the second half of that quote. I play that, when I do my church history class, I play that speech. I said, to think that the National Council of Churches could actually tell the president what to do is so mind-blowingly. But the notion was it was taken seriously at a time. It talks about the profound change in the cultural relevance of Christianity just in a generation. Back to Mark Nolan, this whole thing about French Catholic Quebec. These things can change in a generation. Okay, we got to have denominational staff. Heck, if we shut down the denominational staff tomorrow, we got $250 million in endowed funds and a nice building in New York City. You could build a new church staff out of that, couldn't you? That's a little something to work. We're not starting from scratch. What are we starting from? We're starting from those generations of folks who made those hard choices and made some profound decisions that shaped why all of us are here today. A handful of Anglicans and a handful of Methodists both met in the 1780s and made some pretty profound decisions and choices, which set in motion what became the Episcopal Church, which is similar to, but very different from some other expressions of Anglicanism, which set into motion what became the United Methodist Church, very similar to, but very different from some other expressions of worldwide Methodism. A handful of folks, meeting in the 1780s, made some choices that a couple hundred years later have created things that are profoundly beyond the realm of what their imagination might be. We're in a similar place where we need to make similar choices, dream similar dreams. But we have that legacy of the last couple hundred years, all those resources. Does the Episcopal Church need 10 seminaries? Does the ELCA need 8? No. But we also don't know what a seminary means anymore. We've got to stop fixating about the number and instead be asking, what do we need in terms of theological education, discipleship, and formation? That's what we have to be talking about. And then realize, okay, what are some of the resources we have to live into that vision? Okay, where are full communion agreements as one of these resources that we have? One of these things in our toolbox. Because this is about full communion, right? Right? Back to the topic at hand, which we never left. an exploration of full communion agreements. Okay, we need to, if you've hung in here this long, this probably won't be a surprise to you. We need to acknowledge that parallel processing. How we struggle to understand how we are a church in a post-Christian world, living into this whole slew of agreements that were produced in those death throes of Christendom. One thing, of course, to name straight out, ecumenism did not bring about the decline of denominationalism. Ecumenism didn't do that. In 2010, the Pew Research Group pointed out that of the thousands of denominations in the United States, only 4 of them showed any kind of growth. One of those was the Roman Catholic Church that grew by a whopping 0.4%. And if you look solely at Catholics of European descent, the demographics are exactly the same as the mainline Protestant denominations. The Roman Catholic Church is hemorrhaging Anglo people of European descent. So it's not ecumenism. This whole shibboleth of conservative churches are growing and liberal churches are declining is just absolute utter hogwash. Rather, the waves of these shifts in North American Christianity are sweeping over all of us, albeit in different ways. I talk about this as beware of bear patrol ecumenism from The Simpsons. Homer comes out of his house in The Simpsons and sees a bear in his backyard, so he creates the bear patrol to keep the bears out of his backyard. And so they create this bear patrol, and sure enough, there are no bears anywhere. So Homer says, the bear patrol must be working like a charm. And Lisa says, that's specious reasoning. And he goes, thank you. And then Lisa picks up a rock and says, by your logic, I could claim that this rock keeps tigers away. How does it work? It doesn't work. It's just a rock. Okay. But I don't see any tigers. I think we need to be careful about the whole relationship between causation and causality at a very anxious time in the church. And one of the aspects of this I've heard in various places, this whole notion that somehow doubling down on denominational identity is what will save us and not this ecumenical piece. Because wouldn't you know, just when we started getting into these ecumenical partnerships is when our churches started to decline. I'd like to sell them a rock. The people that say that. Hopefully very expensive rock. So beware of bear patrol ecumenism, bear patrol understandings of causality. So what do we need to do? And this is where the full communion agreements already tell us everything we need to do. Embrace the eschatological vision of these full communion proposals. They're like a big old security hole waiting to be hacked in an operating system. They've got them in there already. Often when you, another time when you know you're getting very close to the end of an ecumenical agreement is when you have to break out the ecumenical boilerplate. Like, all right, I'm going to come up with a few paragraphs to wrap this thing up and wind it down, throw in a couple biblical quotes and, thank Jesus, and then they start playing the orchestra to get you off the stage as you're winding down your ecumenical agreement. You got to throw some boilerplate in there at the end. No boilerplate here. And in something like this, I actually had a slide where I laboriously went through the eschatological components of all these full communion agreements. I decided to spare you that and just kind of do one example. And here's one from Call to Common Mission, paragraph 29. This is not ecumenical boilerplate. It says, we do not know to what new, recovered, or continuing tasks of mission this Concordat will lead our churches. But we give thanks to God for leading us to this point. We entrust ourselves to that leading in the future, confident that our full communion will be a witness to the gift in gold already present in Christ, so that God may be all in all. All of these ecumenical agreements birthed in the 1990s though they were birthed in these last stages of denominationalism, point squarely to the future, not to that past. They point squarely to a future. None of them set up any formal structures for implementation. This is if you read previous drafts of some of these agreements, if you read some of the things that were produced in the 1960s and the 1970s, if you read about the mergers that were produced in the 50s and the 60s, the mergers that created things like the United Church of Christ, the United Methodist Church, the United Church of Canada, and some of the United Churches in Australia, the Church of North India, the Church of South India. One of the great American examples of this was the fact that the Episcopal Church and the Presbyterian Church, United Presbyterian Church, came this close to merging in 1943. This close to merging. the full communion agreement was like a 30-page polity summary, because they were talking about merging two church structures into a single kind of structure. Church of North India, set up this elaborate system for bringing together Baptists, Presbyterians, Methodists, Anglicans, and others into a single unified church. None of these agreements in the 90s did that. There were 4.5 million folks in the ELCA at that time, 11,000 pastors, 7,000 Episcopal priests, a little over 2 million Episcopalians back in 2001. The only structure set up was a 10-person coordinating committee. That's it. Because that wasn't the point at all. To set up any structure to implement an agreement, that'd be an even older institutional model of ecumenism. It's not a cop-out, again, a charge from some other folks, that you couldn't pull off that kind of institutional structure. It was actually the goal. It was consciously chosen as the goal. Because it trusts the Holy Spirit to guide the church into these areas of common mission and ministry. Let common mission emerge from common mission. This is the challenge, right? Didn't set up a formal structure, rather said, we are going to trust the churches to live into that and create what needs to be created for common mission. Unintended blessings. Unintended blessings. I was always amazed when full communion took root in places where I least expected it. I worked to place an ELCA missionary in Taiwan. He's an ELCA pastor. He married a Taiwanese woman. They wanted to go back to Taiwan. The ELCA had no mission presence in Taiwan. I said, funny thing, Taiwan's part of the Episcopal Church. It's, again, a legacy of our denominationalism. The fact that the Episcopal Church has a diocese in Taiwan is part of a post-colonial hangover. But nonetheless, how can it be part of resourcing the church of the future? This person, I said, you know what? I put you in Taiwan. Because it's part of the Episcopal Church, therefore, call to common mission is in effect there, because it's in effect structurally where the Episcopal Church is. So I was able to place this Lutheran pastor in a Episcopal church in Taiwan. Globalization reflected in the full communion agreement. Like I said, there are lots of things we could have talked about we didn't talk about. Here's a way in which a full communion agreement was able to respond to a very small indication of the kind of globalized world we live in. Okay, one of the things that also just blew my mind, post-Katrina, Lutheran Church, Episcopal Church, Lutheran Church, Missouri Synod. Lutheran Church, third one there, Lutheran Church, Missouri Synod, merged their state relief agencies in Mississippi. So the last thing we need to be doing is paying for 3 phone lines and 3 people answering those phones. They realized they had to pool every single resource they could possibly imagine to put everything they could directly into relief and development. On the statewide level, merged those 3 agencies into a single relief agency. Historically, African-American congregations in Detroit, there was again, downtown struggling, historically, Episcopal Church, ELCA congregation, downtown urban ELCA congregation, a downtown Presbyterian church. They called a Lutheran pastor to serve all 3 churches. Because of the overlapping full communions, the Lutheran pastor could serve in the Presbyterian church because of formula agreement, and the Lutheran pastor could serve in the Episcopal church because of call to common mission. So they were able to create kind of an urban ministry cluster. Was made possible because of these, rather than these overlapping full communion agreements being plain old confusing, figured out a way to make it work, to create a tripartite urban ministry cluster. Epiphany Church in Marina, California. The fellow who was called there as pastor called me up to ask me some advice about this, and he said to me, he said, the last thing I want to do is prop up 2 dying white congregations. It's like, this is all full communion is going to be. I don't want any part of it. I don't want any part of it. And I said, well, tell me about your community. Tell me a little bit about the community. So tell me about your church. And so the church was located at a great location right downtown. in a church, in a town that was becoming increasingly multicultural and diverse. And 15 years later, things don't happen overnight. Doubled attendance. It's a multiracial, diverse congregation. And they're the second largest private provider of social services in the city. Started a tutoring center. They got a parish nurse and started offering a clinic, offered a number of feeding programs. Instead of being two struggling, predominantly Anglo congregations, we're able to move into a single congregation, which still has Lutheran and Episcopal worship. How do you preserve enough of those elements within a single context? It's taken 15 years, but an unintended blessing from that. These all show us that full communion can address a lot of these changes in denominationalism, globalization, multiculturalism, common mission. We have that. We have that. But the challenge is on us. I got called all the time back in the days when people actually got phone calls, I suppose. There's this great, ever hear about the sound archive? People are trying to preserve sounds that are going to go away. Like phones that actually ring. And typewriters. Like sounds that are going to go away. Back when I used to have a phone that actually rang. People call me up, what are you doing about call to common mission? I would say, what are you doing about it? What are you doing? You're calling me because you clearly care about something. Let's talk about what you care about and figure out what you can do about it. Because that's the challenge. If we're going to say these full communion agreements are really eschatological visions, we've got a glimpse into how these full communion agreements can lead us into a new way of being church. The challenge is really on us, not on someone else, whoever that someone else may be, the bishop, the denomination. It's on us. Are we ready? Are we ready? As I mentioned with those unintended blessings, I've been really humbled and blessed. It was the best part about working on the denominational staff for 10 years, to get to see all these places where ecumenical cooperation and collaboration is having really profound, transformative effect in the life of the church. But I was also saddened to see some places where it wasn't happening at all. In my exit interview, as I was leaving to become ecumenical officer, they asked me what my biggest regret was. And I said, this is in 2011, after 10 years of full communion, I was astounded that the national staff of the ELCA and the national staff of the Episcopal Church had one shared position. I never would have thought in a million years. Why? Because each turned inwardly and focused on its own reorganization and structure. Did not even, I'm still astounded. I mean, that's a model of this is what can happen if we look inwardly rather than look outwardly and realize how we can be blessed by these ecumenical partnerships that we have. Okay, that's what I got. I actually finished on time, so I have some time for questions. Like you can pull up the schedule. All right, thank you all. Delighted to be here. Questions, comments? You even have a microphone in the back?
We have a microphone
All right.
right here.
Something I was
Could you please tell me who you are, too?
Homer Royer, senior pastor at Jerusalem Western Salisbury Church, Share Ministry, United Church of Christ and Lutheran in Allentown, Pennsylvania. As you were talking, I was thinking about whether the full communion agreements had anything to do with the fact of perhaps running dry of denominational mergers. Was it a possibility that the mergers that took place in the 50s and 60s, I know the Lutherans are 88, did there's some sort of energy that kind of stopped, and then rather than merging anymore, did the full communion idea become more popular or more strong in people's minds?
Yeah, that's short answer. Yeah, but I mean, it was kind of saying it's a confluence of things. Sure, on the reality, the reality check was after kind of a nice run of mergers, we had some merger bumps. Probably the classic example of this was what they used to call the consultation on church union. No, raise your hand if you ever try to use Koku in a Scrabble game. Right? Consultation on church union. It was trying to bring together Episcopal Church, what became the other Methodist Church, Presbyterian, what became was the United Presbyterian Church, 7, 8, 9, at various times, historic Protestant denominations, really an effort to create a single Christian church from those member churches. The plan of agreement that was put forth in 1970, all the churches voted it down. You might have wanted to check with your constituencies before that. I think it speaks to, so yes, on one hand, there's some walls hit in terms of institutional structural merger. However, I think there was also tremendous flowering of baptismal ecclesiology at the time, an understanding of baptismal ministry. I think what people often talk about as kind of koinonia, communion, ecclesiology, they're things that bind us together, that transcend. I think it's a confluence of those two things coming together. I think a realization, can we get to that still end result without having to deal with, so I think it was a combination of a number of things. But part of it, was hit some bumps along the way with still trying to move from a model of institutional merger. And even things like the efforts at Episcopal Church, Presbyterian Church mergers in the 1940s, some initial conversation between Methodists and Episcopalians in the 50s, and then the huge brick wall when all the member churches turned down the Koku agreement. One of the things realizing gets back to Niebuhr as well. I had lunch with one of the former moderators of the Church of South India, which is kind of like, the primate, the Archbishop of the Church of South India, which is a member of the World Alliance of Reformed Churches and the Anglican Communion. It's a member of, those two global bodies. And, I said to him, I just got to ask you, how did you pull it off? The Church of North India, Anglicans, Methodists, Presbyterians, Baptists. How'd you get them on? And he said, they weren't our divisions, they're your divisions. They weren't ours. You brought them. He said, only 2% of India is Christian to begin with. He said, we didn't have the luxury of the divisions that the missionaries brought us anymore. We still weren't ready to let go, I think, of our divisions.
My name's Amy Room, and I do advocacy work for the ELCA in Pennsylvania. And I imagine that the shared Episcopal ELCA staff you mentioned is our international advocacy position in D.C. Your example of the social service agencies realizing they need to combine forces in order to have the greatest social impact seems to me to reflect, too, on our shared advocacy ministry. I know that now we've just started a joint Episcopal Lutheran office in Nebraska, and there's another one in the works. But we seem to be woefully behind because as Lutherans, we can't accomplish much in the state of Pennsylvania. We need to work with our other ecumenical partners, and we do, but that could be magnified. I'm just wondering what else you've seen about where we bring our voice to social concerns together that have come out of these agreements that we could be learning more from and modeling more.
That's a great question. I think it's important to highlight some of the places where we're seeing some pretty profound changes have been in areas of advocacy and some aspects of social services. And that one position that I mentioned was in international advocacy in the Washington offices of the ELCA in the Episcopal Church. I think the question is, the way I've been reflecting on this in the last couple of years is, sort of how do some churches that have some pre-existing partnership already in place, it's kind of, it's in some ways, we Episcopalians and Lutherans can think logically of one another. And with United Methodists, Presbyterians, how do we begin to think of, we sort of have some ready collaborative partners. One of the challenges I see is how can we take that core and that base, and if we are going to have any kind of impact or any kind of voice, how do we begin to use that to build kind of new kinds of coalitions in that way? And a very specific example, before I moved to Columbus, Ohio, I lived in Madison, Wisconsin. And we got this governor in Wisconsin that some people don't like, some people do. But we had huge protests in the state capitol in 2011 around some issues around collective bargaining and some union issues. And there's an Episcopal church that's right on Capitol Square. The state capitol is there, and there's Grace Episcopal Church, which is right there. And the rector had the brilliant idea of, why don't I open the door and let people come in and hang out while they're protesting? And he figured maybe clergy will kind of gravitate towards this place since it's a church. And sure enough, it's where a lot of the clergy who had some serious issues around some of the social justice implications of things that were being handled on the state level began to gather and meet. And the thing is, it was not just those usual friends. It wasn't just the Presbyterians and the Methodists and the Episcopalians, the ones we already kind of have those partnership. It was pastors of the predominantly Hispanic Latino Pentecostal churches in town. It was one of the few times that historically African American Baptist and Methodist churches ever came to any public social meetings because of the broad implications of this. So maybe that was kind of a big aha moment for me is if Christians are going to have any kind of voice, it's going to require how can we build a kind of flexible series of coalitions with folks who we have not traditionally been partners with, and with the realization we're not going to agree with each other on everything. We're going to, this is something that I went to this, I think one of the lowest moments of my ecumenical meeting life was when I went to this group that was billing itself as the broadest ecumenical table in North America. And they're going to talk about poverty. What could go wrong? What could go wrong? What could go wrong? It quickly moved into we have to address the systemic injustices in society that create poverty, and we have to have people make better decisions in their lives which affect their own condition. And we could not come up with a statement on poverty. Like, you would think, because Jesus talked about that a little bit, around some other stuff he talked about it. So I think that we're coming from that meeting, when for Christians to have any kind of impact, it's going to require building all sorts of kinds of networks of advocacy and collaboration. But again, this is in some ways winding back some of our institutional notions. This doesn't necessarily mean forming an organization where we're all going to speak as one voice on everything, on all things. How can we move to productive affinity-based networks? I think that's going to be a real challenge. But I think, again, this is a way in which things like this is where the National Council of Churches and State Councils of Churches have been so tremendous in creating the kind of infrastructure that can help do that. Does that get at the question at all?
Getting there,
Yeah, I mean, I don't have the answer, but I think those are some of the things that need to be part of that.
Pastor Darla Swan. Tom, first of all, I want to thank you for that incredible sweep through the history of the full communion agreements. I deeply appreciate your presenting that with a sense of reality as well as hopefulness. My question for you would be, based on your background and experience and the history of the agreements, what do you personally hope for, specifically, as far as the ecumenical movement is concerned, both nationally and globally?
I'm pausing because the initial answer is pretty simple, but unpacking it could take the rest of the day. The ecumenical movement needs to go back to being primarily a grassroots, lay-led movement that's a bunch of networks working together on things. What happened was, the ecumenical movement in 1900 was a whole bunch of movements and organizations, student Christian movements, social justice movements. It was a whole bunch of networks. And instead of thousands of people talking, look at the Edinburgh Missionary Conference in 1910. One of the most diverse one historian of religion referred to it as the most diverse gathering of Christians since the Council of Nicaea. I meant that in a good way. So the ecumenical movement, as it was birthed in the late 1800s, early 1900s, was this dizzying array of affinity-based networks, some of which were denominational, some of which weren't. The Evangelical Alliance is probably one of the most prominent organizations In the 19th century, it was a non-denominational organization that people of evangelical persuasion, whether Episcopalian, Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist, came together. I mean, there were these affinity-based networks, some denominational, some not denominationally based, that would get together at big events and kind of figure out what some of their next steps were. And in the 20th century, we turned the ecumenical movement into a small group of professionals who were specific representatives of their institutions. We kind of flipped the whole thing. Instead of being this largely lay collection of networks, it became a clerical, professionalized extension of denominations. And then we sit around and wonder, why don't people in our churches care more about ecumenism? Because we look at some of the trajectories and the way the ecumenical movement became. By the way, we did the same thing with lots of things. I mean, how did I like to say, Christians in North America managed to outlaw alcohol without a denominational staff ever getting involved. I don't approve of that, by the way. But it goes to show we were able to get things done without having institutionally, denominationally based entities. How did they do it? A bunch of Christians who really cared about this formed a grassroots ecumenical organization that in turn built partnerships with non-religious based organizations as well to change the Constitution of the United States. Ecumenical has got to look like that. We got to wind it all back. We got to wind it all back. And how can it be that kind of grassroots network of people committed to particular things who are willing to form these kind of malleable kinds of coalitions? Now, we can spend the rest of the day, how do you actually do that? How do you actually do that? It's painstaking, it's complicated, it's difficult, it's contextual. I mean, this is something about ecumenism as well. The context matters so much. The way where there's how can you draw out general principles, but also realize you need to figure out how can you adapt these to particular contextual situations. I mean, that's when I think about the future of the ecumenical movement. And the thing is, that's what it's going to look like anyways. We could just have a hand in helping to shape that, or you can just let everything we have crash. It's like when there were two of us in the ecumenical office, there used to be two ecumenical officers. We used to come back from these meetings of the National Council of Churches and say, "You think there's going to be a National Council of Churches next year?" It was kind of like we had to ask the same question over and over and over again. And Bishop Epping would always say, "We got to keep going because if it goes out of business tomorrow, we'll create a new one the next day. We have to have one. We got to have some sort of forum for Christians in North America to relate to one another, talk to one another. Whether it looks like this one or not, who knows? That's why we have to keep going. Because if it isn't there, we're just going to create a new one." Of course there'll be an ecumenical movement. We shouldn't have the hubris to imagine that any single one of our institutions or denominations or conciliar agencies can somehow, because it's of God, it's not of humankind. It's God's intention for us. And that's something that hopefully, if we continue to keep framing it in that way, it's part of God's intention for us. So we sort of have no choice, and even if we do nothing, some aspect of ecumenical cooperation will emerge. And that's something that, I was, one of the students at the seminary came up to me the other day and said, "How do you keep Sabbath? How do you keep Sabbath? We're just so stressed and so overworked." So the way you keep Sabbath is remember that it's God's intention for creation. This is something I learned from my Jewish brothers and sisters, right? It's not whether you have a choice to schedule it or not. It's whether you are willing to live into the creation that God has intended for you. It's God's will. That's why you have to do it. It's just like God says we should care for the poor and love the Lord our God with all our heart and neighbor as ourselves. God's built Sabbath into creation. Ecumenical movement is God's will and intention for us. And so, if we don't do it, someone else will.
Joy Kaufman, Presbytery of Huntingdon. It seems to me that a lot of things are working relative to the communion agreements. You're absolutely right. I look around the room and I see the Lutheran pastor who's serving as one of our Presbyterian churches, and I see one of our Presbyterian minister members who's served with some Lutheran churches. So that's good, and I find that the people in our pews are very often ahead of those of us who work in the structures, because in every instance where we have going back and forth across the bounds that used to divide and don't anymore, the people in the church called our office and said, oh, by the way, we need a pastor, we found this really good one, and could you all vet this person and make sure that their theology is okay? I also see the Church of the Brethren pastor who's serving with one of our churches. And so the agreements of mutual understanding have allowed us to look beyond the traditions with whom we have formal agreements. So all of this is really cool.
Very cool.
It's very cool. And it gives people hope in ways that maybe 30, 40 years ago they would not have had hope. Nonetheless, all of these churches are modest and becoming more modest. And I appreciated many of the things you said. In particular, at this moment, the conversation about how does a person go bankrupt, first slowly and then quickly? That's going to happen in almost all the churches in the presbytery with which I serve, unless there's a huge sociological shift, and there's nothing pointing to that happening. So, where do you see what is new that is going to emerge, beginning to emerge? Or do you? Since you work in a seminary, perhaps you see something at the front end of a curve that others of us do not yet see.
Sure. And thank you for saying that. It's also important to point out, just as I was talking about how, we're sort of swimming in the success of the ecumenical movement in turn. We're swimming in the success of that in a lot of local levels as well. There's a lot of challenges in various levels as well. Nonetheless, there's just a dizzying variety of ways and places in which these full community agreements are being lived out. For what it's worth, I think the question is, I think it's going to look, we're going to let go of denominationalism, but find ways to preserve the charisms of that. We simply can't. It's a sin against God. Division is a sin, and we have embraced and sunk our teeth deep into it for the last couple hundred years, and we're reaping that in some ways. I don't know exactly what it's going to look like. I can make all sorts of predictions, guaranteed correct to your money back. But I think it's going to have to be some way in which we can bring the variety of Christian expression together in a way to meet the needs of the church that I'm not saying we're going to create kind of a single church, because guess what? There never was a single church. The Roman Catholic Church in 12th century Europe looked very different in Spain than it looked in England, then it looked in Poland, then it looked in Italy, then it looked in, they had variations in ritual, they had variations in liturgy, they had variations in specific theological emphases, variations in structure. That was never a monolith. The Orthodox Church is extraordinarily diverse in its regional experience. There never has been a single church. It's gonna be whatever emerges from the debris of denominationalism, and it's gonna be messy. And I think some other things where that's where the gospel yesterday around the end of the world always comes in handy. Because remember one of the things Jesus said about the end of the world? A lot of people are going to come and try and tell you about it, but nobody really knows. So don't listen to those people. So I can tell you all sort of what I think about, but I know it's going to look different. I know it's going to be something that I think preserves some of the charisms. Because every epoch of the church is built on the previous iteration. There's going to be aspects of this legacy of denominationalism. They're going to be part of what the church of the future looks like. But I'm not entirely clear what that's going to be. Maybe one more? So I see Warren coming up here. Are we done? Okay, I'll be glad to answer that. Okay, he's giving me the firm 11:30 cutoff. I'll come talk to you.
My name is Caroline Dunleavy, and I want to thank you for bringing out the role of the laity, because I have lived this as a layperson and an educated layperson at that. I didn't say that very well, but when I'm formally educated, I just graduated after 5 years of part-time study at Lutheran with my MAR, with no call to be ordained, no interest in that right now. I've worked for the Episcopalians in Philadelphia for 8 years, full-time. I've been a part-time music minister in the United Church of Christ. But before all that, I was in the ELCA all my life, with the LCA, because you see my age, and then ELCA. So I have had that journey, and one of my former Lutheran pastors said, Carolyn, you've done more for ecumenical relations than some of the pastors who are working in that area. So he has a very good sense of humor, but I want to thank you for that, because I think that lay people, as far as I have seen, are far ahead of some of the clergy people in this area. So, and there are some of us who even go on and get formal training and can be of use to all of you in this area. So I thank you for bringing that out.
I'll have to say, when all that Occupy stuff was coming around, I found it kind of ironic, all that 1% and 99% stuff. You think about who are the 1%ers in the church, not the clergy. Thank you. Thank you. All right, thanks, friends. Warren?
Thank you all. It's time now to transition as we get ready for lunch. Restrooms are through that exit door, and they're in this hall right behind. Guy, are they the only accessible restrooms?
Down to the end of the hall to the left.
Or you can go down the end of the hall and to the left. Two places you can find restrooms. Lunch will be served here at 11:45. I want to say particularly thank you to Tom for the excellent presentation that he gave, provided for us, and a lot of things to think about and to digest and to work on, whether we be a part of the Pennsylvania Council of Churches who's sponsoring this event, or whether we be a part of judicatories or our congregations. This afternoon, we're going to be talking about these common communion agreements in areas of 3 panels. One panel will talk about how the history of the agreements, the other panel the judicatory perspective and the congregational perspective. You're to choose 2 of the 3 panels, pick 2, the Panera Bread idea, and go and work on the panels, as there'll be moderators for each panel. So I want to say thank you again to all of you, and we'll see you back